All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics and Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development Seminar Series. For the Filipinos, let's take a 1-hour break from election issues, and I hope you will enjoy this morning's seminar. And also, we hope that you enjoy our little virtual tour of the campus. Next semester, the university is starting to open up, and there will be more classes doing face-to-face. So we hope to welcome you all in person in our university. So before we begin, as usual, let me just remind everyone of our house rules for this seminar. We will let the speaker finish her presentation first before we entertain questions. Zoom participants, kindly stay muted and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation, except of course our speaker. During Q&A, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. Please also do let us know your institutional affiliation. There are also people who are joining us on Facebook. You may post your questions in the comment sections, and also please to identify your institutional affiliation. Slide videos and other materials from the seminar are posted on our website and on our YouTube channel only when the speakers give their consent for sharing them. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker, who is my classmate at the University of Hawaii way back when we are doing our PhD. Olga Stoddard is an assistant professor of economics at Brigham University and research fellow at IZA, Institute of Labor Economics. She is also a research director at Science of Diversity and Inclusion Initiative and co-organizes a bi-weekly online seminar on the economics of discrimination and disparities. Dr. Stoddard research uses insights from behavioral economics to study gender and racial differences in labor markets and to evaluate the impact of various interventions aimed at increasing diversity in the workplace. She is here with us today to present her research titled Strength in Numbers, a Field Experiment in Gender Influence and Group Dynamics. Dr. Stoddard, Olga, the virtual screen is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I hope one day I will be able to visit you all in person. In the meantime, I'm grateful to have this chance to present to you. Maha, will you let me know if you can see it in full screen or not?
Yes, okay.
Is it showing up as full screen right now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let me
Maybe you can, yeah.
Let me try sharing so that you make sure the slides are showing up in full screen. All right. All right, 1 second. How about now? Let's see, still not, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, this
okay,
is fine.
now, yeah, this is.
I'm gonna
try the full screen mode.
View full screen. Okay, now?
Not yet.
Okay, I think we can just, I think I could just do it like this. Is this okay? Are you able to?
Can you click the green button on top, on the right top, so it will be bigger?
Yes, of course.
That one?
Is this
okay. Yeah, I think this is better.
Goodness, it's, sorry, let's try the full screen. I'm not sure why it's not doing the full screen. All right, let's see. Share. All right. This is not full screen, right, for you?
Yeah.
How about now? Still?
No. I think this is fine.
How did we do it when we were practicing?
Can you share the desktop and not the PDF?
Okay, let's try.
Okay, now it's full screen.
All right. This is gonna work. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Well, thanks so much for having me. This is joint project with a couple of my colleagues at Brigham Young University, And it's an ongoing project. We appreciate any feedback or comments that you may have. As I mentioned earlier, you're welcome to ask questions throughout or save the questions for the end. But if there's any clarifying questions, I'm happy to take them throughout the presentation. And probably something I don't need to mention to this audience, but as you know, in recent years, concerns about lack of female representation at various public levels have led to various initiatives to try to diversify decision-making bodies, anything from school boards to corporate boards and in between. And these types of initiatives throughout the world have varied quite a bit in their intensity. So for example, in the United Nations, many countries have implemented what are called gender board quotas. These stipulate that at least 40% of the board members on corporate boards have to be women. In the US, the intensity has been quite different. So very few states have implemented similar legislation. And even among those, the ratio of women on corporate boards has never been anywhere close to 40%. In California, for example, the requirement is that only 1 out of 5 board members have to be women. So the idea, and in fact, there is a lot of evidence suggesting that what California corporations have done in recent years is they simply added 1 woman to a previously otherwise all male board. And so pictures like these are not hard to find across many different contexts in the US or outside of the US. And presumably, of course, the purpose and the idea behind these interventions has been to bring women's voices to the table, to allow them to contribute their ideas and expertise to actually influence decisions. However, many critics of these interventions and policies have argued that these quotas and these initiatives have failed to achieve this goal because, as much recent research has shown, when women are in the minority or when they work in teams with men in groups in which they are underrepresented, they have a really difficult time getting their voices heard and actually being able to influence decisions. So work in economics and many other related disciplines, such as social psychology, has found that women in mixed gender teams receive less credit for joint work. They're the ones being asked to do more non-promotable tasks, and they're also much less likely to actually be the group leader or to represent the group in some capacity. This, of course, poses a number of interesting empirical questions that we address in this paper. The main question being, what happens to women when they are in male-dominated settings, often either the only woman or one of the very few women in the group? Are they actually able to contribute their perspectives and expertise when they have a seat at the table, or do they face barriers to fully contributing? Can they lean in and become full participants in group decision-making? And how do their experiences more generally compare to the experiences of women who are in the majority in similar decision-making bodies or teams? So to answer this question, we conduct a field experiment with a top 10 US undergraduate accounting program. So this program provides a really nice setting for this experiment to answer this question, because like many business programs in the US and outside of the US, it uses a group-based approach to really emulate sort of work in teams outside of educational settings. Students are assigned to groups of 5 in the beginning of their school year, and they work in these groups very intensively. So on average, they spend about 20 hours a week interacting in these groups. They work on assignments together, on homework, on cases, and they even turn in some exams as a group together. As you can see, the share of women in these groups is fairly small. It's only about a quarter. And historically, these groups have been assigned to have about one woman per group. So the program historically has tried to dilute women across groups and to have at least one woman per group. So what we suggested to the program is to try and randomly assign women in these teams across different conditions. So we have 3 different conditions that are randomly assigned. The first one is what we call a 1F condition, in which there's only 1 woman and 4 men. So this is the status quo. This is how these groups had previously been assigned in this program. We also have a 3F condition where women are now in the majority. There are 3 women and 2 men. And then because there's so many more women in this, so many more men rather in this program, that necessitates creating all male groups. And so we have these 0F groups that we're going to use in some analysis as well. And then throughout the next 2 years, we collect a number of outcomes, behavioral outcomes, survey measures, administrative outcomes, as well as lab outcomes about these groups, how they behave, to try to understand whether random assignment to one of these conditions influences how women are perceived in these teams and how they are evaluated by their peers. And what we find, just to preview a little bit, is that lone women, so women who are the only woman in the group, are significantly less likely to be rated as influential in their group by their peers. They're also significantly less likely to be chosen to represent the group in an incentivized decision. And they're also less likely to actually empirically affect group decisions. This is all compared to equally qualified women who are in the majority in their groups. We have a number of mechanisms that we explore in the paper. So we try to understand, why is this the case? Why are women unable to convert their presence into actual influence on these teams? So for example, we'll look at things like talk time. Are women on minority, when they're in the minority, are they talking less? Are they participating less in these discussions? Are they less competent? Do they self-promote less? Or perhaps maybe these results are driven by homophily. And so we evaluate all of these potential mechanisms and find that none of them are able to explain these significant gaps in influence that we observe. And what really changes across the conditions is how men evaluate women. So when women are in the majority, men are more likely to perceive women as more influential and select them as group leaders or spokespeople. We look at also improvement over time, or changes over time rather, because we have data for 2 years on these teams. And so we can show that in some respects, you see some improvement over time as team members get to know each other and women are able to establish their influence in teams. But across many outcomes, we actually see very little improvement, if any at all. So I'll talk more specifically about what those differences are. I'm going to describe the experimental setting and our conditions very briefly. And then if there are any clarifying questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll be happy to answer. So as I mentioned, we work with a top 10 undergraduate accounting program in the US. This program has about a quarter of their student body being women. So as you can see, we have about 540 students in the sample. This is across 2 years. About 390 of them are men and the rest are women. We randomize these students into 5-person teams. As I mentioned, there are 3F teams, women in the majority, 1F teams, women in the minority, and then all male teams. These are the 0F teams. These are 5-person teams, and as I mentioned, these students stick together in these teams for a period of a year. So they work intensively together on related schoolwork, but also outside of the school setting in social settings. They interact quite a bit. We collect a number of outcomes, and I'll describe each of these separately, starting with the baseline survey. So prior to group assignment, this is before the semester even begins, before the students start this program, We conduct a survey to collect a variety of outcomes, demographics, and grades, prior leadership experience about these students. So we know quite a bit about them, including some attitudinal measures, things like their attitudes towards sexism, risk aversion, conflict avoidance, sort of standard things that we would want to know about these students. We then, once they're placed into these teams of 5, we collect monthly survey outcomes about their peers. So we ask them, who in your group is the most influential, for example? Who is most supportive? Who in your group is the most competent? So those kinds of things. We also ask them about their perceptions of their group interactions. So do you think your group is coherent? Do you enjoy interacting with your group members? At the end of their experience in the program, at the end of the second year, we also collect an exit survey where we ask them about their graduate school plans, internships, jobs, and we supplement that with some administrative data that we get from the placement office about actual career outcomes for these students. And I'll talk about some of those towards the end of the presentation. And then one other final source of data, which ends up being really important in the study, is we bring these teams into the lab twice a semester. Once in the very beginning, when they first meet, they have just been assigned to these teams. They're just getting to know each other. And the second time at the end of the semester, 4.5 months later. And this is so that we can actually observe what happens over time. Do these gaps that we often observe in laboratory settings in women's ability to contribute and to exert influence, do they exacerbate over time in sort of outside of the lab natural setting? Or do we see them getting better? And so far, lab studies have not been able to answer this question because often in the lab, you bring people, you bring strangers to interact with each other for a brief period of time. These are not repeated interactions. In our experiment, we contribute by adding a natural setting. These are naturally occurring teams. They interact repeatedly. And so we can look at how these outcomes change over time, which is quite novel and valuable. So let me discuss what happens in the lab when these students arrive. They participate in what we call a team building exercise. And this is actually an exercise that the program was using even before we began experimenting. They called it a team building activity. And you probably have seen something similar. The premise is you tell these groups that they hypothetically have landed, on the moon, and they need to survive for a period of 3 months. And you ask them to rank the items that are provided to them. So you have a list of items, there's 15 of them, things like, rope and box of matches and 5 gallons of water. You ask them to rank these items in the order of most to least important for survival on the moon. So this is of course hypothetical, but there are right and wrong answers to this exercise. And in particular, you can see the left column here, NASA rank, which is a ranking provided by NASA experts. So there is a correct answer. There are items that should be ranked higher than others. And so this task is nice because we can actually see whether students perform well on it. Do they actually know, which items should be ranked higher or lower, in which case we can measure their competence on this particular specific task. So we first have the students do this task individually. It's incentivized. They get $50 for completing the task best among everybody who's participating. So this there is an incentive to doing well. Then we have the teams deliberate. We have them talk with each other about coming up with the team ranking. So as opposed to an individual ranking, they come up with a group ranking. And we actually record these deliberations. So we have transcripts and audio recordings of who is speaking, how much, who is saying what, who is getting interrupted. And these are the data that we're going to use in some of our analysis. Finally, they come up with a group ranking. Again, it's incentivized. The best group gets an additional $50 for each team member. And then right after the task is completed, we ask them to rank their team members based on who was the most influential, who was the most competent on this task. And we essentially ask them to evaluate each other as sort of a peer evaluation would entail. We pay them, at the end of this exercise, as we had promised. And one thing I'm going to mention is part of the ranking of each other. One of the questions we ask is, who in your team would you like to be your spokesperson? And the spokesperson decision is sort of like selecting a team leader that would then represent the team at a follow-up exercise where they have an opportunity to earn additional money for the team. So they have a chance to select somebody to represent them to earn additional $50 for each team member. So I'll talk about what we find, but very quickly, I want to show you some just randomization checks, just to show you that across the different conditions, so 1F, 3F, or 0F, we don't observe any statistically significant differences in demographic characteristics or attitudinal characteristics like, egalitarianism or sexism along those dimensions. So women in the 1F groups and women in the 3F groups are equally capable, as you can see here, measured by their GPA. They are equally qualified to be in the program as the men are. These are not sort of shrinking violets. These are women that are highly qualified, have really high GPAs, even have more professional prior leadership experience than the man in the program. So this is just to show you that across the different conditions, there aren't any significant statistical differences across these groups. Let me jump into some of the main results given these randomization checks. The first one being about influence. So if you remember, we asked these group members, who is the most influential person on your team on this particular task that you just completed? And the question we ask here, because we have randomization across team conditions, is, does gender composition matter for perceived influence on the task? So does it matter if women are in the 1F group, in the minority, or in the majority for how they're perceived in terms of their influence? Let me show you, explain a little bit how to read this graph. So what we're measuring on the y-axis here is the ratio of votes for women as most influential divided by their ratio in the group. Because remember, we have the 1F groups and the 3F groups, and the proportion of women, of course, is different across those two conditions. So to control for the gender composition, we divide the votes that women receive by their number in the group. And so what you see here, the blue bar, is the ratio of votes for women being most influential divided by the ratio of women in the group. Okay, the dotted line at 1 would mean that we're at equity, that this is essentially women being selected most influential as if at random, right? In the 1F groups, that would be 20%. In the 3F groups, that would be 60%. And so what we're seeing is deviation from equity in both conditions, but especially in the 1F condition. In the 1F groups, women are chosen as most influential about half the time relative to what would happen if they were chosen as most influential at random. In the 3F condition, when women are in the majority, they're chosen as most influential about as you would expect if women were chosen at random. But the bottom line is you see a really strong statistically significant difference in other group members' perception of women's influence in the group, depending on the condition in which they're in. And remember, they're randomly assigned to those conditions. So there's nothing different about women in the 1F group relative to the 3F group. We then also look at least influential measures. So one of the questions we ask is, who is the least influential? And here you can see sort of a reverse pattern. where women in the 1F condition are significantly more likely to be chosen as least influential relative to the women in the 3F condition. In the 3F condition, they're chosen as least influential, about as you would expect at random. And then in the 1F condition, they're much more likely, disproportionately more likely to be chosen as least influential. So this is the first result. We confirm that in our regression framework here with different models, both controlling for a variety of demographic characteristics and not. And you can see the coefficient here about 0.5, which suggests that when women are in the minority, they are about half as likely to be chosen as most influential relative to when women are in the majority. The second important question we ask is, well, maybe what we're finding here is just because these are perceptions of influence, right? You're asking team members to evaluate their other peers, and it's not incentivized, right? They could say whatever they want. And so the question is, does this still persist in incentivized kinds of tasks? So in particular, in the spokesperson selection task, where you ask group members to select a group leader, a group spokesperson to represent their team to earn additional money. And these, you can imagine, mimic a lot of interactions in the workplace. So for example, in many settings, somebody on the team has to present the results to the client or to present the project to the boss. These are fairly consequential decisions that provide a lot of visibility and credibility to those that are chosen to present. And so we think of these as mattering quite a bit outside of sort of just educational settings. So what happens when we do ask teams to select their spokesperson? Here we see very similar patterns. We see that in the 1F groups, once again, we're far below the dotted line of 1, which would be considered as sort of equity baseline. And so again, when women are in the minority, they're much less likely to be chosen as the spokesperson relative to when women are in the majority on these teams. And again, the coefficient here is very close to 0.5, so really similar difference in across the two conditions. As you can see. Another outcome that we're able to look at when we consider a variety of decisions that these group members make is whether the women on teams are actually able to influence these decisions empirically. And the way we measure this here is we look at whether the group tasks. So remember, they do the task individually and then they complete it as a team after they've deliberated. And what we look at is whether the final outcome of the team task, how that relates to each group member's initial individual ranking. And whoever is the closest to that final ranking must have been the most influential group member on the team in terms of actual empirical influence. And so that's how we measure our dependent variable here, is whether a woman was most influential in at least one of the two tasks. Because remember, we have them do this task twice, once in the beginning of the semester, once in the end. And so we look at sort of the most conservative measure, which is at least once, was the woman empirically most influential? And once again, what we find is in the 1F groups, the women are almost never the most empirically influential person when you look at the actual outcome of the task. The white bar here, I'll explain just very quickly, is the expected outcome. So what would you expect, because the decision takes place across both times, given the gender composition of the teams, you would expect the likelihood of a woman being most empirically influential in the group to be about 36% in the 1F teams and about 84% in the 3F teams. And you can see that in the 3F teams, that's about where women are at. They're being chosen, or actually in this case, they are actually exerting influence about 86% of the time. They're being most influential. In the 1F groups, they're far from the expected value of 36%. They're at about 21%, which suggests, again, these gaps in influence for women when they are in the minority. So a very consistent picture emerges here where we see women, this just confirms this result that in the 1F condition, women are significantly less influential relative to the 3F condition. So I've hopefully have painted a pretty consistent picture for you in this experiment as far as main findings. Women are significantly less influential across a number of outcomes when they're in the minority versus majority. The question that probably many of you have in your mind is, well, why? What is happening in the 1F groups that is not happening in the 3F groups? What are the mechanisms or the channels that are driving these results? Thankfully, in our experiment, we have very rich data that we have collected. So we're able to look at a number of important mechanisms that you would expect to matter in this context. In particular, we can look at competence on the task. That's probably the first question in everyone's mind is, well, are women just not that great at this task? The task is kind of weird, right? You have to rank these items on, for survival on the moon. Maybe women just don't do as well on this task, and that penalizes them in terms of their influence as maybe it should. So that's the first mechanism we'll look at. The second one is this sort of idea for leaning in. You probably have heard this in popular press, but also in academia, this idea that women tend to shy away from competitive environments. They tend to shy away when they need to exert, competence and confidence. And so perhaps they're just not speaking up in these deliberations as much as men are, and therefore are not getting the influence that they deserve. So we'll look at that as a potential mechanism as well when we measure speaking time and speaking turns, because remember, we recorded their interactions, so we're able to actually see who is speaking how much, who's contributing to the conversation. And so we use that data to analyze the second mechanism. Then we also look at self-votes as this idea that women might not be self-promoting as much, and maybe that's driving the results. And finally, homophily, which is women sort of voting for other women, maybe because there are no other women on in 1F teams. There is less of a likelihood for women to be chosen as influential. So let me show you some pictures here, and as well as some tables to address each of these mechanisms. So the first one is competence on the task. We measure that by looking at task performance. Remember, the unique thing about this task is that we actually have really detailed information on how well each person does on this task, because they did the task individually first. And so we look at task errors, which is sort of this measure of, how far away are you from the NASA experts, from the correct answer. And the coefficient you want to be looking at in this table is the third one, which is female interaction with task errors. Okay, and you want to compare it to the task errors. You want to subtract that. And what you can see, if you look at the 3F group, so this is column 3 and 4, is nothing is significant here, which means that women's competence on the task is neither rewarded nor punished based on neither rewarded nor punished as far as their influence goes. So they don't get any credit for doing well on the task, but they also don't get penalized for doing well on the task. In the first and second column, which is the 1F condition, you don't see that. You see that women actually do slightly get penalized for doing well on the task. It's pretty close to 0 if you subtract those two coefficients. So it's not a huge economic gap, but if anything, they see slightly somewhat of a penalty. So it's not that they're not competent enough. They're just as competent on the task. They do just as well. It's that their competence doesn't convert to actual influence. In the second analysis, we'll look at the second potential mechanism, which is who talks in these group deliberations. And what we find is, as you can see by the interaction of 1F and female, is that once you control for a number of demographics, women in 1F teams do not speak up any less. They speak just as much as the women in the majority. So that cannot explain, once again, the gaps in influence that we observe. I'll skip that to go on to the next mechanism, which is voting for yourself. So that could be, one potential channel that explains women's lack of influence. Maybe they're not as good at self-promoting. Maybe they just sort of sit there, maybe they're talking, but they're not talking very confidently, and they're not voting for themselves. So we look at team members' propensity to vote for themselves. And once again, we find no differences, both for men and women. Actually, it doesn't matter what condition they're in, they're just as likely to vote for themselves. So that, again, can be ruled out as a potential mechanism. And so what is left is man's behavior, how men are voting for women as most influential, how men are choosing women as spokespeople, and what we can see across the 1F and 3F conditions, what these bars represent. The orange is the propensity or likelihood of women to vote for other women, which in the 1F condition means women voting for themselves, right? Because they are the only woman. But in the 3F condition, that could be voting for myself or for other women. And then the blue bar here is the likelihood of men to vote for women as most influential. And the white represents, again, just our expected value. So what would we expect if these votes were assigned as random, okay? And as you can see in the 1F condition, we're far below expected value for both men and women. So men and women are less likely to vote for women as most influential. In the 3F condition, you can see that men now are much more likely to vote for women as most influential. In fact, they're just as likely to vote for women as influential as they would be if these votes are assigned as random. Women are still lagging behind. So it's the man's behavior that changes when they interact with women in the majority versus when they are in groups when women are in the minority. And that's the big takeaway from our results and the analysis so far. Finally, I know I don't have a lot of time, so very briefly, you may wonder, well, what happens over time? Because we have these data for several months. Does it improve from one interaction to the last one at the end of the semester? And what we can see on some measures, it sort of does. So you can see the very first top left panel looks at survey influence. So this is monthly peer evaluations. And we can see that we start out with a pretty large gap between 1F, which is the blue, and the 3F, which is the orange in the beginning, but that gap closes over time. Although, caveats here, you can see the confidence intervals are huge. These are not precisely estimated coefficients. So very noisy, but there is some suggestive evidence that the gap is closing over time. It also seems to be improving on the spokesperson selection, which is the graph just below that. But on all the other measures, which is task influence and actual influence in the lab, we don't observe any improvement over time. So there is mixed evidence on what happens as teams interact together more. On some measures, particularly, it seems like sort of these global evaluations of women's influence, there seems to be improvement, but on task-specific evaluations, we don't see much of an improvement over time. So when you ask group members who on this task that you just completed is the most influential group member, we don't see things improving even after groups have interacted for 4 months at this point. We also look at their grades at the end of the semester and find no differences across conditions over time. We do a lot of robustness checks to make sure our results are robust to different specifications and models. And I know I'm almost out of time, so just to conclude, I want to summarize what we find, which is that across a variety of outcomes in this natural setting, in this field experiment, we find that women in the minority experience a gap in participation and influence compared to when women are in the majority. In particular, we show that by their peers, women are ranked as most influential significantly less when they're in the minority. They're also much less likely to be chosen to represent their team, and they're less likely to actually influence a group outcome when we look at the empirical influence. We explore a number of mechanisms, and we find that this gap cannot be explained by things like self-votes, homophily, or leaning in. So in a lot of the literature, anecdotally, you hear that if women would just lean in and talk more and participate more in these discussions, they would surely be granted the influence that they deserve. And this is unfortunately not what we find in our paper in this experiment. Leaning in or participating or speaking up does not seem to convert to greater influence for women. We find some improvement over time, but in more general sort of global assessments, but not in task-specific assessments, as I illustrated. There's a number, of course, of open questions that you may have at the end of this. We try to address all of them in the paper, so I'm happy to talk more about these. Is this more about tokenism or more about gender? We have some teams that ended up with 2 women, so we can explore whether having another woman on the team helps. A short answer is no, but I can give a more nuanced explanation as well. And a bunch of other things that we are currently working on, which is what happens when these interactions take place online, which is what we're doing right now, right? COVID has shifted a lot of the norms around how we interact, how we meet with our coworkers, colleagues, friends, in professional and educational settings. So a current experiment that we are running is looking at comparing these kinds of team deliberations and interactions in virtual settings to in-person settings. Preliminary data show that virtual settings unfortunately exacerbate some of these inequalities. And we're testing a number of potential interventions to help close these gaps, which I don't have the data on quite yet, but just to give you an idea. So I'll stop here and happy to take any questions and hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga. It's really very interesting, and especially if you can extend that in the outside the school or laboratory setting, right? This is really interesting. Okay, at this point, we can entertain questions from the audience, both in Zoom and also on Facebook. If you are joining us on Facebook, you may write your questions in the comment section. So if you are on Zoom, feel free to unmute and show yourself to ask your questions. Okay, we have one from Carl Handok. Olga, you remember Carl?
I do.
Olga, I hope you remember me. You were on your way out when I came in at UH. But thank you. That was a very interesting presentation, and I could feel the effect of like women empowerment. Maha was just bugging me to attend your seminar, and I was convinced. So to say. But yeah, I just wonder if like, would there be any effect of like reputational signals for women? So for example, will the results change if there was like an ex-ante announcement of some signal of capability for the women? For example, there may be, you can have treatment, for example, where women's capability were announced through, say, some IQ tests or some leadership tests that would kind of signal their capability beforehand. And I wonder if that would change the dynamics, even if there were only one women in the group. I don't know if you consider that, but I'm just I would be happy to share. To know your thoughts or your speculations on what might happen with that.
Thanks.
Thanks.
You so much, Carl. That makes me wonder if you are one of our referees on the paper, because that came up in the review process. And actually, in the revision of the paper, we were asked to think about this as a potential mechanism. Because if you think about the literature and discrimination to date, there's sort of this distinction into statistical and taste-based discrimination, right? And so if we want to understand why is this happening, why are women not being granted influence, is this driven by the fact that the men aren't getting strong enough signals about women's competence or performance, that maybe even when women are competent, they're interacting just a couple of times on these tasks and maybe they're not getting to experience that. And so we are exploring that currently through a follow-up study in which we tell group members about sort of a distribution of performance. So they don't know exactly who did, who got a certain score, but they know an approximate distribution. And in the 1F groups, that's going to equate to a much weaker signal, right? Because there's only one woman, so you're getting less of a signal about women's competence or performance, versus 3F groups in which you get a lot of information about women's performance. And preliminary results are showing that that does seem to explain some of the differences that, as you hypothesize, the getting stronger signal about women's performance does seem to translate into greater influence. So that's one iteration. In another iteration, we have, we randomly assign who is the formal leader of the group. So we tell groups halfway through the semester, now we assign leaders, and sometimes the leader is a woman, sometimes the leader is a man, and we track these outcomes post leader assignment. And what we show is when women are randomly assigned to be leaders, the other women in the group do much better. In terms of influence, participation, ability to affect group outcomes versus the minority groups. In the female minority groups, in that experiment, we have 2 women on teams because we want to look at, not just your own performance as a team leader, but other women in the group. And so we're able to show that women in the minority female groups aren't able to reap the same kind of benefit from a female leader on the team. These are quite preliminary still because we're kind of in the process of still running them and finalizing some of the analysis, but certainly exactly along the lines of where you're thinking. Girl, so great to see you.
Thank you, Olga. Amazing paper. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Card. Anybody else from Zoom? Yes, Bing Radok. So Dr. Bing Radok is also a member of our faculty. Olga?
Yeah, hi Olga. I'm intrigued by figure 1. Sorry, I didn't catch the early part of the presentation. So how big is the group?
So these are 5-person groups. And then we have 2 conditions, 1F, which is 1 woman and 4 men, and then 3F, 3 women and 2 men.
Okay. So looking at figure 1, my initial thought is it possible that, say, if it's 4-1, 4 men, 1 woman, is it possible that maybe it's not really influence that's being captured by the participant's choice, but maybe a bias? For example, if there are more women in my group versus men, and I'm a woman, then my bias is I'll choose another woman. Not because I find her to be influential, but because I am the same gender as that particular choice. So, I mean, was that controlled in the analysis? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's a 2-part question. The first part is, do we control for the share of women in the group? I think this is related to your question, which is we do. This is not just reflective of the number of women in the group, right? This is already conditioning on the share of women. So we're taking the ratio of votes for women and dividing by the ratio of votes, the ratio of women in the group. So that's addressing the first point I think you made. The second one is interesting, which is, I think, getting at homophily, if I understand correctly, right? This idea that as a woman, I might be more likely to vote for other women, and men are going to be more likely to vote for other men simply because of in-group bias or some kind I think you called it bias, right? But this sort of social identity argument, there's a large literature confirming that that tends to be what's happening in a lot of settings. So we do look at homophily. If I go to this figure here, and we examine that by looking at whether women, what's the likelihood of women to vote for other women versus what's the likelihood of men to vote for women. Sorry, so this is actually not the homophily picture I want to show you. The homophily story I want to show you is, okay, so yeah, this is it. So you can see that in the 1F condition, the orange bar, right? This is women voting just for themselves because there are no other women in the 1F condition, right? But in the 3F condition, you can vote either for yourself or for the other women in the team. And when you compare that to the white bar, which is the expected value, which is roughly about 84%. So that's how much would you expect a woman to be chosen as most influential if these votes were just given at random? That would be 84%. Okay. And women are still below that. So it's not that women are disproportionately more likely to vote for other women. They're actually less likely than men are. And so we conclude that it's really the man's behavior that's changing. Go ahead, Ben, I'm so sorry. Put your hand up.
No. I just pressed raise my hand wrongly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I got it. Thank you.
Does that make sense? Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Bing. So Bing is also doing research using experiment, Olga.
Awesome.
Because I worked on an experiment. We're still writing the paper. It's on group dynamics. So whether the size of a group affects productivity. But I didn't consider gender there. Maybe I'll refer to your paper and then we'll see if there's any interesting result that we can find. Thank you.
I would love to see it too, Ben, when you have the paper. Sounds
Thanks.
really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Bing. Anybody else from Zoom? Also on Facebook? Anybody? You may just unmute and show yourself. I have a question, Olga. Maybe just a little clarification. So you mentioned in your discussion slide that additional number of women would not really affect the results. So does that mean that there is a critical or optimal number of women such that women exert influence in a group?
Yes, very good question. So in our experiment, we, if you recall, have two conditions, 1F, 3F. We also ended up with some groups just by chance because of how we were assigning teams with 2 women. We have about 15 of those groups. So it's not a ton, it's about 75 students. So not huge numbers. So we don't include them in the main analysis, but in some supplementary analysis, we'll look at, does having another woman help? And what we find is 2F teams, so women with teams with 2 women, have really similar outcomes to 1F teams. They look pretty much identical in terms of influence, in terms of spokesperson selection. So you don't see much of a difference there. So preliminary or sort of suggestive evidence that having another woman on the team doesn't help. Now, the natural question is, well, how many women do you have to get to actually see positive, results? And it seems like the majority is the answer. So in our experiment, that means 3 women out of 5. Of course, the group size matters, right? But it seems like the critical mass, as you mentioned, really is that women have to be in the majority. There is a long-standing literature in social psychology on critical mass, which corroborates these findings. So that literature is largely theoretical. There's also literature from the lab where people have found similar results. Unless women are in the majority, they are not able to exert equal influence to the man. So there seems to be, a number of studies from a variety of disciplines that have found similar patterns. And that seems to be having women in the majority, which is a challenging thing for a lot of firms that have a hard time recruiting women, right, or hiring women in male-dominated settings where you just don't have as many women. And so when we've presented this to the firms, across just a number of different sectors, it's always very unsatisfying, right? Because people want to know a solution to this without having to hire more women, and it seems like that solution just doesn't exist in the long run. It's a systemic kind of issue that can be solved by having more women on teams, having more women in these settings.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And it would really be good to know your follow-up studies, your answer to Carl's question on reputational effects. As a follow-up to that, your participants are students, is that right?
That's right.
And they don't know who are in their group, is that correct?
So at the very beginning, as they enter the program, they don't know anything about their group members. They're placed into groups randomly. And then they interact throughout the whole semester, or really just the entire year, is they interact in this group together. So they get to know each other really well. But in the beginning, they do not know each other. That's correct.
Okay, they do not know each other at the beginning, but eventually they know.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. So that's right. They work together on assignments, on problem sets, on schoolwork, but also in social settings. We ask them if they, go to lunch together, and they, overwhelmingly spend quite a bit of time, about 20 hours a week together in those groups.
So these are first-year students in the program?
So they are first-year students in the accounting program, which in the US means they are sophomores. So they are in their in their third year. Usually, actually, they're juniors, which means they're about in their third year of their undergraduate studies.
So they are already taking their special or their academic majors, right?
That's right.
Yeah, because I was wondering, again, following up on that reputational effect, because in a school setting, oftentimes the smartest person in the class, they are usually become the leaders in any events or any extracurricular activities, right? So if they know each other, they oftentimes students would choose people the smartest. So again, the role of the reputation would play in how women also are perceived to become leaders. Regardless of the gender, right? So maybe that would really be a good, follow-up studies on this one that would explain a lot on the mechanism.
That's right. Yeah, and we thought, as we look over time, we would see exactly what you're saying, which is that as men, get to know and experience these women's competence, that their influence also will grow. And as you saw, we don't really see, robust evidence of that on most of the outcomes we measure. So that is still a puzzle. And, that's where we're left with kind of, is it that they're not getting a strong enough signal? Do you have to make it so salient that women are competent and capable to really have it convert to influence?
Yeah. Okay. We can entertain one more question if there's any more pressing questions from the audience. Anybody? Okay. At this point, I'd like to invite everyone to turn on their camera so we can have the much awaited portion of the seminar, our photo documentation. So please turn on your camera. So as we wait for the others to fix their hair and their smiles, let me first invite you to our next seminar. So the last one of the series. So it will be on May 25, and our guest speaker is Dr. Divine Gracia Rodriguez from Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research on the site-specific nutrient management strategy for rice, a microeconomic analysis. And let's see. You may visit our website for materials from previous seminar, and also subscribe to the Ateneo de Manila University YouTube channel, and you can get the recordings of the previous seminar when you click the playlist economic seminar.